I just want to thank Patch and the Foundation for making this possible. I think the work you're doing is amazing. And it's these sort of forums that we need at this point in time to fight the good fight. Because certainly in the English-speaking world, in some ways we've given away our profession and we need to claim it back. My message to students today is how if you have a dream, you can actually attain it. And you need to understand the context you're working in, because within that context, you can make all sorts of things happen. I was having a discussion with Andrea from Cornell yesterday, and she kept on saying, but that's not an architect's work, that's not an architect's work. I'll show you today how most things you have to go outside of your discipline to actually make things happen. And I think the necessity of architecture, I had the pleasure of teaching and being with Juhani Palasma in Helsinki recently. And he's done a book called The Architecture of Neuroscience. And in that book, there are 3 essays. And the essays start looking at how we create. They start looking at the fact that 90 to 95% of what we do is intuitive, and only 5 to 10% logic, but we only teach the logic, or only get judged by the logic. And the other thing is the point that architecture and beauty are a necessity to our well-being integrally and spiritually as human beings. It's not just shelter. I was born into Africa, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief background to that context, because without the context, it's not easy to understand the course of action that I've taken. The Egyptians were fascinated with the relationship between the Nile and the Milky Way, and they related it to time. And they looked at Orion that has 26,000-year cycle, and it forms an arc in the sky. And at some point in time, one of the 13,000 years between that arc, it located itself over the pyramids. And what they did is they drew a line down Africa, which is known as the Nile Meridian. And it starts with the Sphinx looking down Africa, and it finishes with Gandhi's ashram. And along that line are all these sacred sites that are linked to the lion in one way or another. And this map shows the projects we've started to get along that line, and the red areas show the peasant cultures that I've made an attempt to try and document and gain understanding of African space making. Andrew Freer, when I went to the rural studio in Alabama, made me show this to his students because they kept referring to South Africa as a country. They were just farm children. And you can see it's United States, China, India, and by the year 2050, probably a third of the world's population will be here. It's the place of the fresh and the new. It's the place of something unexpected comes out of Africa all the time. I, as a 60s kid, was born into apartheid. Okay? We were kids who were questioning our future. And I'll show how certain events, the shooting of Hector Peterson, which won the World Picture of the Year, changed our society. And now at this point in time, Sam Nzima, who took that picture as a young boy, he was a young man of about 19 at the time, and he knew that if the police saw him, they'd take the spool out. So he took the spool out and put it in his sock. And then when the picture was published, the police came to him and said, if you pick up your camera again, you're dead. So we had these realities. I live in a conflict society. I choose that. And he went and he started a bottle store, and he started a different life. And he's now come and put something like 5,000 euros on the table and asked us if we'd help him do a museum. We're just very lucky that his son's been promoted to the CEO of South African tourism, so we can probably access money and do it. A lot of my talk has to do with sometimes the reason you do buildings is to provide work for people. The building's just a pretext. And another time, it's how you make connections. And so we started to do some designs for him, and he insisted that the entrance to his museum be a replica of his Asahi Pentax 1000 camera, so we showed him what that could be. I had a student in the office, so we did this very crude rendering. and then you go into a space and you look through a keyhole, and then the gun goes off and the stones get thrown. So how do you bring theater into telling people's stories? A lot of this work has got to do about storytelling. Okay, Pancho Guedes, who's the only living member of Team 10. He's in his late 80s. Unfortunately, he's lost his short-term memory. He opened my eyes to Africa and its creative genius. And he prompted and encouraged me for my engagement with living cultures, to learn before social engineering got to them, and my engagement with African artists. This is Pancho quite recently. I'm not going to deal with Pancho, it's another story. But what he did do, instead of me throwing petrol bombs at the police and getting jailed, he said, why don't you go and document the living cultures that you so admire when you come down to Mozambique. I was courting my young wife, who was 16 at that time. Well, she became my wife. We became friends, and he became my mentor. And I was also curious because I was born into a sort of Calvinist, Anglophile, Christian Judaic world that was very narrow. It ignored completely that we had any cultures, that there was any relevance in African culture. And the university I was at, which was one of the top 100 in the world, taught art from the Lascaux Caves to Jackson Pollock. We have the world's best collection of rock art, and we had 80% of our population who, do the most marvelous things. It's taken until 1980 for that same university to wake up to the fact. I didn't go to Rome. I went to these people. And this young girl who is potent with fertility is coming out in a ceremony where it's a little bit like within a certain time span after her first menstruation, she's someone who has to be accepted by her community as this changed wonderful thing, which is a woman who is the carrier of life, and that's revered. And so what she does is it's a bit like the chrysalis and the butterfly. I'm not pressing these. I don't know why they're changing. Oh, sorry, it goes smaller. And I observed that through her mother and her are illiterate. They can't read. But through personal adornment and the central axis and the dualities of our body, they learnt the same lessons as Renaissance man did. And they applied it to their architecture, but not just their architecture. They applied it to sculptural embellishment, freestanding sculpture, formal gardens, mural art, and the architecture. And they did everything. The men only do the thatching of a roof. And they started to build up incremental spaces through a veranda, through an enclosure, through symmetrical enclosure. And I suddenly started realizing there was something wonderful going on here, and there were also diagonal extensions that were happening. And there was the golden section being applied. So I suddenly realized ordinary people have in them the essence of architecture. It's central to who we are. And when you go into an Ndebele settlement, like this one over here, you'll notice the men are here because the man is the gatherer. He's the carrier of the seed. He has no place. He guards the cattle because you exchange cattle for wives. It's your wealth. You guard the entrance. You have to defer to go into the world of women. And although it's a patrilineal society, when the men get circumcised at the age of 17 and go into the Felt School and they come back, they defer to the men. Why? Because there's this mixture of Old Testament, New Testament, and their old beliefs. Now, we in South Africa all have a maid who does the ironing, and we have a gardener, and we know them by their first name, but we know nothing more about them. So I went out to actually live with these people, and I found a whole wonderful world there, and things handled with huge dignity that we had just taken for granted. And just look at the consensus between two wives. To have symmetrical gable ends, to have symmetrical hip ends, to make this into a circle, because that daughter's a Sangoma. She got a divination, and she's something else. The firstborn son's there. The married children are here. So there's a social structure that underpins that. And it's very far removed from our own world. And I suddenly realized something beautiful. And then when I went into these worlds, I realized it's as though these people have Palladius Quattro Libri next to them because they're so articulate. They know how under the vastness of the African sky, through giving emphasis. Here they don't have much money, so they've got charcoal and they've got white line. And they also have the Reckitt's blue that you used to get from Lever Brothers to make your washing white. And that gave them a blue color before PVA paints. And they said, we see what we want to see and we make it our own. That's what architects do. I mean, I just know we went to this fantastic sculpture museum yesterday, and the sculpture, I understand Patch Mangado's work, and I understand Rafael Manea's work through that sculpture. It's one of the mental references that have been in their subconscious. And it's fantastic that that happens. And what these women did is they went out into the villages in South Africa where they saw Victorian gateposts, they saw Victorian gardens, they saw gables, they saw Art Deco, and they reinterpreted. They saw 1950s American cars going past with fins. So they just reinterpreted that. They're honest about it. And whenever they have a ceremony, that's what they do. And they do it often. If you want to be a designer, you get good at design through designing, not talking about it. That's why when you teach design, you have to practice. And I found this ordered world, and I also realized that they had a different concept of the landscape. It's a place of danger and a place of fertility. There are lions and animals that can kill you. So what's the defensible space that they make? It's a patio. But it's not the patio of the hacienda. It's not the patio of the Roman house, but it's a patio. And then this is drawings of mine from of a house that's the culture started about 1936. Why did it start? They were losing their language. Your language is your culture. You lose your language, you lose your culture. It's as simple as that. It's very important to you. It hasn't got the outward expression. It's internalized because they adopted a Tswana architecture. I've just been across the world to see great architecture, and right here on my doorstep, you have a threshold of entry. You have a bigger threshold of entry to something more private. It's exactly what happens in Egyptian architecture. It's what happened in Roman architecture. It's what happens when you go to Finland and you come here. And I go and see Baragan, and in the backyard, just from leftover paint, you've got this magic that's happening. And I learned about human scale. I learned about measurement, sitting down, because it's all devised from human scale. And also learned that there's a crossover. When these women go and work in a Calvinist home, the law of a Calvinist home is cleanliness. That law becomes part of their law. You can eat off this floor because it's a transfer from one culture to another culture, and how the water goes through. And this is also truly sustainable. And then I became an activist, and I cut my teeth on social architecture under apartheid. I became an Olympic athlete, and I would have made 2 Olympic finals. I was ranked 6th in the world, but I supported the sports boycott, which drew people's attention to our plight under apartheid, and then was banned going to the Olympics, but it was a sacrifice I was prepared to make, and it made me aware that you need to make a sacrifice if you want to change things. And that's what you need to do in your world now. You as young architects need to go and define a new position for yourself, because you can make your work. One of my first social enterprises was a shopping center I did in the 70s. The initial work is very colorful. I was working with the Ndebele who were colorful. Okay? And it was an African man who had the audacity in the apartheid government's terms to come along with his own money, because he was trained in London in tropical medicine, to build a shopping center at the place of his birth, so his brother who'd got an economics degree could actually have a practice. Everything was done to block him. And although I was trying to interrogate in my own mind, what do rural Africans, when they come to shop, do instead of traveling all the way into town, we soon realized that you had to get the advocacy and you had to get the buy-in of these people. At this time, the laws were being stopped, because if you traded with some potatoes on the side of the road, you got beaten with a sjambak and jailed. The laws trained that you could allow the informal sector. The laws also changed about immorality. So the taxi drivers, the power rested with the people, and they wanted to burn this building down because apartheid did to Africans what communism did to Eastern Europe. It denied you access to the free market system. Okay? So they thought that if this African man had this much money, he must be in cahoots with the government. We had to show them that it wasn't. And we had to go through a process of using a benign person in America to encourage an oil company to build a petrol station so we could get the rights to. In other words, you were swimming against the tide. The building's less important. The color scheme comes from these machekas. These colorful machekas are Indian traders who understand the Indian market. They don't consult the people. They think the local beadwork is a bit dull, so they make it bright. They do a deal with a Japanese trading house, and you get a Japanese Shangan Indian connection. They actually drive the ritual trade. And you look what people do, and then you transfer it, you interpret it. And it's how you reinterpret things and give them new meaning that makes it essential. It's not copying. It's how you do that. And Pancho had taught me, start interacting with architects. This is Jackson Lungwani. He transformed a hillside into the New Jerusalem with a beginning and end, with Golgotha at the end, with Christ's office, with the God's altar, with Christ's altar. God's altar is for the woman, Christ's altar is for the men. And I helped him erect an aerial so he could beam thought, because he said thought was energy. And he told me the exact day that Mandela was going to be released, 3 years before he was released. So I started this relationship with him. And at the same time, I started altering a house, my own house. And a hybrid architecture starts taking root. And I developed the saying, a house is not a home unless it's a village. Why did I do that? Because in the Anglophile world, when you talk of house, it's the object. And what I did is through building a cottage in the garden here, through putting the cars over here, you define a forecourt, you define an entrance court, you define inner courts. So you start articulating the outdoor space, and you also start looking at diagonal extensions. Just spatial lessons learned from engaging with African cultures. And an African believes that a house is not a village, a home unless it's a village. To him, the total area is his house. Where you grow the maize, where you enter, where the rubbish is, where the graveyards are, and then so it's a different construct. And if this is going to be your constituency, you need to understand that, and you need to look at how incremental growth can happen. These are the palaces of illusion that Ndebele women basically put over their womb, because the womb and home are synonymous. These are the public buildings that they see. And when they do their beadwork, they use mathematics. I failed maths in matric. I failed it at university, and I've just done a set work with mathematicians, taking the way these people work with the rectilinear geometries of their architecture, and they work with beadwork to show that their literate grandmothers of Africans who battle with maths used mathematics, and we're relating it so they overcome their fear of it. And then I started sculpting a garden in an obsessive way, because Jackson was doing it, so it was part of my mindset. And the garden is about, my wife's about plants, I'm about the ruggedness. And we started actually creating a piece of paradise in our own way, in a place where labor's very cheap. And we started exploring the different potentials of stonework and the different potentials of extruded landscape and how you do that, and it's part of an ongoing process. And the jacarandas dropped their leaves. They came from Mexico with the British who fed their horses in the oatmeal, and they now outdo the jacarandas of Mexico. So there's this transfer that happens all the time, which brings about a hybrid architecture. And my wife is about the porcelain bowl and about the floating daisies, and I'm about this roughness. It's probably why we've got on so well. And I also love a home to tell your autobiography. I'm going to show you a project later on for a billionaire in Chicago who's a philanthropist who's had to move into a corporate environment. He hates the corporate environment. He hates the arrogance of design in his terms, and how I've learned from that. But it does tell the story of who you are, because there are those artifacts that tell that story and the transitions from one space to another. I was into Adolf Loos's Raumplan, and then I was into my African stuff, and there was a synthesis between the two. Then there's the story of living cultures, cultural heritage and tourism. Came 94. In this earlier period of work, I didn't do any public work because I didn't support the apartheid government. And I started doing projects in the townships, sometimes avoiding arrest just for doing it. But I measured up great settlements, and from those settlements, I started abstracting places of ritual that were beautifully proportioned. The way you make fire, the way you do verandas, the way you take what the Spanish call a ramada, but it's called a chotla in Tswana, which is just some poles that you put shade over. And then I started going into these people's lives and measuring up how they lived. And it's fantastic when you measure up on how they live, because you actually start really understanding how people furnish space, how they really do things. And then I started applying those in 94 to projects that were real. This was outside a game park where it was contested that the Africans had laid claim to the land. And it's where you as a tourist could come out of the game park and come and listen to people's stories, eat their food, and watch plays. And I started applying those lessons with soil cement blocks, 5% cement, interlocking. We set up a brick-making industry. I would take this man into the hills and I'd show him that if you make piles of stone, how long does it take you? How long does it take you to take it to a tractor? And how, if you're going to have to cost your work, what does that mean in terms of cost? And that's what you do. And I'd been in Mali with the Dogon, where you use short bushes on corners to make a roof. We applied it here, crossover of cultures. You can't, these people do beautiful paintings with cow dung. You can't mix cow dung with cement, so we got them plastic gloves. But look at the outcome. It's really beautiful. So you're playing with that same materiality that Anna Punda was talking about earlier. And then you take people with no skill, they're unemployed, and in 6 weeks, you train them to build a facility for themselves, which has got a cross movement of air, and then you show them how that facility can grow, and how if you put shade structures in, it can actually be beautiful. And then the same thing happened further north, where overseas visitors wanted to actually come and stay near a village where they could hear the chickens, they could wake up in the morning, they wanted the house type to grow out of the house type, they wanted to have a museum facility, they wanted to see how those things, and you do a museum of pottery. And pottery is very important. A lot of Southern African pots, a woman gets buried in her pot, okay, because it's the container of life as she is. It's symbolic. So you suddenly move out of your mindset and you find beautiful things. We had to add toilets to these facilities, but what you were doing, you were interrogating different things. And you were always talking in an interactive way with the community, winning their confidence and learning from them, going to them not as the professor, going to them not as the architect, but say, I'm coming to learn from you. No one had ever spoken to them before, let alone say, we want to learn from you. And they're proud of their culture. And then you build a hotel with a 51% share to the local community, and you get African lawyers to come and tell them what it means to set up a trust, okay? And you explore the potential of thatch and how a tree can give you the idea of supporting that thatch and how it can sit in the landscape. And how when you come out of the cold winters of Europe and you pay a lot of money to stay here to seduce your partner, you can stand naked and watch elephants, and then the bed is right under the center points, and it's also got a rectilinear geometry. You're celebrating all of those things. And then this is an urban project, and I said to Anna earlier, Anna Purna was responsible for getting me to go to SEP last year and to meet Doshi. And when you meet Doshi, he's in his late 80s, but he moves like a 37-year-old. And Doshi tells you, there are three things that he says. The one is, everything you do as an architect must be a temple to the gods. There's no not good thing you must do. The next thing is that we as Westerners have this concept of certainty, and that's where all the anxiety comes from, because life is not certain. It's uncertain. And you learn from his wisdom. And the students woke me up at 4 a.m, took me to the Temple of the Sun on the 21st of March, the day after my birthday. And there they introduced me to the goddess of architecture, which is a statue. And I spoke with the goddess of architecture, and all the things I spoke to about have come true. And one of them is this project. It's a good medicine. You should do it. Sandton is the Boomberg. In Johannesburg, what happened, came 94, no Africans were allowed to, by law, live in the city unless you were cleaning staff and you lived on the roof of buildings. Okay, typical American city. Came 94, the town was occupied. Your doctor's room, where you went with your mother, the department store, the police station, the hospitals were occupied by people claiming what they thought was their right. It's like you going away from this town and coming back, and Algeria has occupied the entire town. And it was quite a mindset to deal with. What happened with the white population fled to Sandton and built an American Boomberg, which is now like Houston, okay? And yet 3 kilometers away, there's a settlement where there was infrastructure for 70,000 people, but there are 500,000 people. So imagine what happens to sewage and grey water. And this building, which is taken, I've been involved in this since 2004. It had 3 government agencies that were supporting it. Whenever you got a new head to a government agency, they didn't want to support the one the old one did. We've now just got the money to complete it. We move on site in 1 month's time. But it's building in the reality of this, urban scavengers, okay? And we had many sites to interrogate. We acted as activists. The competition was to do something outside. We said, no, you've got to do it inside. And for the first time in South Africa, identifying what was historically important, we asked Africans, what's important to you? Not because the British said to us that if a building's 60 years old, it's important. What's important to you? So we've had to learn to have some respect and deference for other people's culture. And Nelson Mandela stayed in this room in 1942 before he became a political person, and he wrote eloquently about it. And so we declared this area a conservation area. And he said to us, if you're going to do anything, tell the story of the people, and don't just tell the story of struggle, tell the story of the success that they've made with their lives. And that's what his instruction was to me. And these shack dwellers here, we did a negotiation with them where we gave them new homes so that we could acquire a site. And my way of dealing with this is to move into the settlement and to document it. I go with a tape. I don't go with anybody. And then I get children to hold the tape, and then you get to know the people. You go into their lives. I go to their weddings. I go to their funerals. The red buildings were built for the Africans returning from our role in two world wars. And Mandela stayed in the room at the end of one of those. The money we've now got, which is fantastic, is going to enable us to also upgrade these. Basically, you have an entrance and 10 families. What a fantastic social unit. And it's been evolved by the people. It's organic. The government wants to pull this down and put them in prefabricated housing so they all turn into drug addicts. And then you look at the defensible space. You look at how do people make those zones of defense, and how do they also very cleverly come along. And I challenge any architect to actually take a 7x7 and plan it better than these people. And how do they steal electrics, and how do they steal things? There's only a collective toilet point. That's going to become part of an upgrade. And then you look at what the politicians promised every South African, okay? One, they promised you a house on 250 square meters, and you start looking at densities. I've got 3 sons, and those of you who have sons, at a certain stage of being a teenager, they get weights, and for 2 weeks they do this, and then they think they're going to go out and meet the most beautiful girl because they've been doing this for 2 weeks. It doesn't happen. And then the weights sit there and they go rusty. So there were some guys across the road from this building who were artists, but they were smoking too much marijuana. So I took them the weights, and they got their picture in the newspaper. And then Reg Parks, who was Mr. Universe, who changed Arnold Schwarzenegger, phoned Arnold Schwarzenegger and got Arnold Schwarzenegger sponsored this. And then Richard Branson from Virgin Atlantic came, and we're now going to get a whole new gym. That's what happens when you engage. And these are the courtyards. Controlled entry by an elder, no place for grey water, communal toilet facility. We're going to put we're going to do a green intervention here, which will be a wonderful way of showing growth. And then you look at what ordinary people do, and you go into their lives. I took Rajiv Kathpali here, the son-in-law of Doshi, and he said, it's relative poverty. This is not poverty. And then you find there's my building waiting to be finished. And this is somebody's died. I'm coming back in a double-decker bus from a funeral, the grave. They slaughtered a beast. The person lay in state, and then they have to feed everybody afterwards. Okay, and this is what we ended up with. We started with negotiations with these people. When you went into this encampment, there were 15 families. When you told them they were getting free houses, it became 72 families. But it's not you to negotiate, you get other people to negotiate. Ended up being 35 families. But it's part of the story. And this ramp is an extension of the street, and then you have an arch, and you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, or past, present, and future, and you